They saw them before they understood what they were. Massive figures approaching over the sea, white-bodied beasts with wings of cloud and wooden skin, moving silently across the horizon like spirits come to life. And behind them, stranger still, came what seemed like men grown out of animals, fused at the waist with creatures that kicked up water and earth in violent rhythm. They weren't ships, not to the Tunna, who had never seen one. They weren't horses, nor riders, nor anything that fit within the limits of their imagination. What they saw, they could not name. What approached them belonged to no world they knew. And what was coming had no mercy. But before that moment, before sails split the sky and gunpowder shattered the silence, there was a world in perfect balance, a world that had never known the concept of conquest, where time moved with the rhythm of tides and the pulse of the wind, and where a people lived not behind walls, but inside the open embrace of land, sea, and spirit. The Tunna people inhabited the Caribbean archipelago long before their names were twisted or erased. From the shores of Cuba to the mountains of Hispaniola, from the rivers of Baracun to the caves of Jamaica, they lived in communities bound not by kings or swords, but by kinship, memory, and respect for forces greater than themselves. They had no hunger for war, no ambition for expansion, and no illusion of dominance over nature. Their world was a network of villages, yucaaquas, each governed by a cacique whose authority was earned through wisdom, generosity, and the ability to speak with both the living and the spirits. Life among them was not marked by urgency, but by continuity. The days began with the rising of the sun over calm waters, the scent of cassava bread rising from communal fires, and the laughter of children gathering fruit beneath the trees. Women tilled the earth, men fished with nets of woven fiber, and the elders passed down stories carved not only into memory, but into the very stones that lined the ceremonial plazas. These were not idle tales. They were the map of the soul, the code by which a people had learned to endure. Religion for the Tunna was not a separate institution. It was a way of seeing the world. The gods, or zemis, were not distant or abstract but inhabited the mountains, the storms, the bones of ancestors, and the wind that carried messages between worlds. Through ritual and kahaba, a sacred hallucinogenic powder, the bohíques, spiritual leaders, entered trance and spoke with what could not be seen, guiding their people through the cycles of rain, harvest, birth, and death with a sense of reverence rarely understood by outsiders. There was no coin, no ownership of land in the European sense, and no prisons, because social harmony depended not on punishment but on participation. Generosity was not a virtue, but a duty. To give was to exist. And in this giving, the Tunna found something far stronger than wealth: stability. Yet it was precisely this absence of weapons, this lack of suspicion, that would open the door to devastation. When the first European ships reached their shores, the Tunna did not raise barriers. They offered gifts. They extended hands. They greeted the newcomers not as threats, but as guests, perhaps messengers from the heavens or lost travelers deserving compassion. What they did not understand, what they could not have imagined, is that these visitors came not in search of friendship, but in pursuit of something far colder: gold, land, labor, and dominion. What the Tunna saw as exchange, the strangers saw as advantage. What they meant as welcome, the others interpreted as surrender. And so, the first light that shone on those ships was not the dawn of a new world. It was the beginning of an ending. But to understand what was lost, we must first understand what existed. Not the ruins that remain, but the vibrant, complex, living culture that once thrived in the forests, rivers, and winds of these islands. Because history does not begin with destruction, it begins with life. And theirs was full of it. To answer the question of who the Tunna were, we must first silence the noise of conquest, erase the maps drawn by other hands, and listen instead to the heartbeat of an island people who called themselves simply Nutana, the good and noble ones. Their world was not measured in borders or wealth, but in relationships, between humans and spirits, between families and ancestors, between land and sky, between body and breath. They did not build empires of stone or forge weapons of iron, but they wove something far more enduring, a way of life rooted in harmony, guided by ritual, and passed from generation to generation through word, gesture, and reverence. The Tana were part of the Arawakan-speaking peoples, descendants of those who had migrated northward from the banks of the Orinoco River, navigating by stars and current until they reached the scattered jewels of the Caribbean Sea. There they established a society that would grow not through conquest, but through connection. Each island held its own yucca-aquas, or villages, and each was led by a cacique, a chief whose power was not inherited by blood alone, but confirmed through consensus, council, and spiritual legitimacy. These leaders often wore pendants shaped like the sun or moon, not as signs of authority imposed by force, but as symbols of their place within the greater cosmic order. Tana society was deeply matrilineal. Lineage, inheritance, and social identity were passed down through the mother's line, and women held roles not only as mothers and workers, but as farmers, artisans, and respected voices within the community. A child was not born into isolation, but into a web of responsibility and belonging, where everyone was known and no one was left behind. Their homes, called bukpas, were built in rounded forms from palm and cane, designed not just for shelter but for communion. Families lived together around a central kana, or ceremonial house, where the community gathered for dances, prayers, and public decisions. It was here, on these packed earth plazas beneath the open sky, that the most sacred rituals were performed, rituals that bound the visible to the invisible, the living to the dead, and the present moment to the eternal cycle of nature. The Tana worldview was animistic, yes, but far more than that, it was integrative. The gods, or zemis, were not abstractions. They had names, shapes, personalities, and presence. Some were carved into stone and kept in shrines. Others lived in trees, caves, rivers, and dreams. The most revered among them were Yakaya, the benevolent spirit of rain and fertility, and Gwabansuks, the fierce force of storms and chaos. Their interplay governed life and death, growth and destruction. But even the most feared spirits were not enemies. They were to be respected, negotiated with, understood. In this spiritual ecology, there were no devils to be destroyed, only forces to be balanced. The spiritual leaders, known as bahakwas, functioned as healers, diviners, and keepers of the sacred. Through the use of the kahaba powder, blown through ritual tubes into the nostrils, they entered trance states and communicated with the zemis, seeking visions, warnings, and guidance. These ceremonies were not sideshows. They were foundational acts of governance, healing, and cosmic alignment. No decision of weight was made without consulting the unseen. Their language was melodic, filled with vowels and open sounds, and though most of it has been lost to time, remnants still echo in the speech of the Caribbean. Words like hurricane, hamaka, barbacoa, and kenubd, twisted and redefined by the colonizers but rooted in a voice far older than their ships. That voice told stories, sung through generations, of great migrations, ancestral caves, celestial births, and the sacred origin of the sea. These were not myths in the dismissive sense. They were memory, encoded in symbol and preserved in oral tradition as a living archive of who they were and where they came from. Art for the Tana was never ornamental. It was functional, sacred, and symbolic. They carved stone and bone into pendants, tools, and ceremonial objects, each bearing intricate designs that told stories or invoked powers. Their cotton was spun into belts and headbands for rituals, dyed with vibrant earth tones and adorned with feathers, shells, and teeth. The body itself was a canvas, painted for war, for dance, for celebration, or for mourning. To see a Tana community at the height of its vitality was to witness a society that had solved many of the dilemmas that plague modern civilization. Food was shared. Elders were honored. Children were protected. The environment was treated as a living partner, not a resource to be drained. Their science was observation, their philosophy was interdependence, and their politics were rooted in dialogue, not dominance. And still, they would be called savages. Still, they would be dismissed as primitive. Still, their names would vanish from the scrolls of empire. But they were not forgotten. Not by us, because to understand what was destroyed, we must first restore what was true. To understand the greatness of the Tana, we must abandon our narrow definitions of civilization, those that equate complexity with concrete, success with conquest, and intelligence with the ability to dominate. The Tana built no pyramids, no vast bureaucracies, no standing armies. But what they created was no less extraordinary. A way of living that prioritized balance over ambition, cooperation over control, and continuity over spectacle. Their world was not carved into monuments. It was woven into the living fabric of each village, into the rituals that marked every season, and into the quiet understanding that the land did not belong to them, but that they belonged to the land. Their villages, bohíques, were neither chaotic nor crude. They were arranged with intentionality, often in circular patterns that reflected their spiritual conception of time and space as nonlinear, as flowing, as eternal return. At the heart of each community stood the Beatty, a communal plaza not only for games or meetings, but for ceremonies that reinforced the cohesion of the group. It was here that marriages were celebrated, conflicts resolved, and the great stories of origin retold under the stars. Around this central space stood the bohíos, the family homes with circular walls and conical thatched roofs, designed to withstand wind and rain and to breathe with the tropical climate. These homes were shared, inclusive spaces. There was no locked door, no private hoard, no exclusion. Agriculture was not just a necessity for survival, it was a sacred act, guided by seasonal cycles and ancestral knowledge. The Taíno cultivated cassava as their primary crop, transforming its bitter roots into edible bread through complex, labor-intensive methods that had been perfected over generations. They grew maize, sweet potatoes, peanuts, peppers, cotton, and tobacco, often in canucos. Raised garden beds formed in spirals or mounds that prevented erosion and enriched the soil naturally. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was done without purpose. Every act of planting, harvesting, and preparing food was woven into the spiritual and social rhythms of the community. Fishing, too, was more than a means of sustenance. The Tana knew the tides and currents intimately, building canoes, from hollowed trees so expertly crafted that some could carry up to 50 people across open water. They used nets made from woven plant fibers, hooks carved from bone or shell, and even crafted fish traps from stone inlets and woven reed funnels that demonstrated not only ingenuity, but a patient understanding of the ecosystem they lived in. They took only what was needed, and when they took, they gave thanks. Trade flourished across the Caribbean Sea long before any European vessel arrived. The Tana exchanged not only goods, cotton, salt, food, tools, dyes, ornaments, but also stories, songs, and spiritual knowledge. There was no currency in the strict sense, but value was recognized through utility, rarity, and reciprocity. In this web of exchange, no one grew rich by impoverishing others. Power was not centralized. Hierarchies existed, but they were fluid, bound by responsibility more than privilege. games played a crucial role in their cultural life, not only as entertainment, but as social and even spiritual rituals. In the Beatty, they played a ceremonial ball game also called Beatty, which carried both athletic prestige and cosmological meaning. The game, played with a rubber ball and strict protocols, often reenacted mythological struggles between forces of nature or spirits, serving as a living form of storytelling. Spectators did not merely watch, they remembered, they witnessed, they affirmed. Music, dance, and oral tradition were the lifeblood of their cultural memory. Songs preserved genealogies, chants conveyed laws, and dances synchronized the body with the pulse of the earth. Each movement, each rhythm was more than aesthetic. It was a form of knowledge transmission, a living archive encoded not in books, but in bodies, voices, and shared breath. In this world, no one was illiterate because memory was communal and everyone participated in its preservation. Their system of justice was restorative, not punitive. If someone stole, the goal was not revenge, but reintegration. Shame was social, not institutional, and it came with a path toward healing rather than exile. Conflict resolution often involved dialogue mediated by elders or spiritual guides, accompanied by offerings, gestures of repair, and renewed commitments to communal well-being. The Taíno understood something that modernity often forgets, that to build a truly lasting world, one must first build a stable home. That prosperity is not measured by what a man owns, but by what he is able to give without fear of lack. That power means little without belonging. And that identity is not something imposed from above, but something grown from within, nurtured over time, like a tree that bends with the wind and still stands tall. It was not a utopia. There were tensions, moments of inequality, rivalries between caciques, and even episodes of inter-island warfare. But these conflicts did not define them. What defined the Tana world was the deliberate effort to live in equilibrium, with each other, with the land, and with the spirits that watched silently from the trees, the mountains, and the stars above. This is the world they built. Not with stone, not with empire, but with continuity, with care, and with meaning. To enter the spiritual world of the Tana is not to step into superstition or fable, but to cross a threshold into a system of meaning that shaped every aspect of life, from the planting of yucca to the nomming of children, from the timing of a journey to the moment of death. The Tana did not separate the sacred from the ordinary, nor the material from the spiritual. To them, every stone held a memory, every tree whispered lessons, and every breath was part of a living cycle governed by unseen forces that were neither fully benevolent nor fully cruel, but powerful, responsive, and always present. At the center of this world stood the zemis, sacred beings, spirits, gods, ancestors, and natural forces, all condensed into forms both physical and invisible. A zemi could be a carved figurine, a mountain, a cave, a gust of wind, or the shape of a storm on the horizon. The word itself referred both to the spiritual entity and to the object through which that entity was worshipped or contacted. To an outsider, a zemi statue might seem like a crude idol, but to the Tana, it was an axis between worlds, a channel through which humans could speak to the forces that shaped rain, fertility, disease, war, and fate. The pantheon of the Tana was not hierarchical like the gods of Greece or Rome. It was a complex web of powers in constant motion, sometimes harmonizing, sometimes colliding. At the center stood Yakaya, the spirit of goodness, rain, harvest, and serenity, often associated with the mountains and the life-giving clouds that hovered over them. In contrast, but not in opposition, was Gwabansux, the fierce spirit of storms and chaos, whose swirling wrath was said to dance through the Caribbean as hurricanes. She was not evil, but unrelenting, a reminder that nature offers abundance only in balance with destruction. These were not remote deities to be worshipped from afar. They were intimate presences, addressed in chants, fed through offerings, and danced into being during ceremonies that involved the whole community. The Tuna did not pray in silence behind closed doors. Their spirituality was loud, embodied, and shared. In the Bata, during rituals that marked sowing, birth, healing, and death, the community moved as one, singing, drumming, inhaling the sacred kahaba dust that opened the senses to the voice of the spirits. Under its trance, the bohíques, spiritual guides, would receive visions, interpret signs, and speak with the voices of the ancestors, delivering warnings, instructions, or forgiveness. The kahaba ritual itself was no mere spectacle. It was a disciplined and sacred act, often performed after days of preparation through fasting, meditation, and purification. The powder, derived from the seeds of a native tree, was not taken for pleasure but for revelation. Inhaling it through a bifurcated reed, the bohíques would close his eyes and begin to sway, entering a state that allowed him to cross the veil between the visible and the invisible. What he returned with was not personal fantasy, but communal truth, messages about planting seasons, signs of illness in the village, omens of approaching danger, or confirmations of harmony between the living and the dead. Ancestral spirits were not distant memories, they were living presences. The skulls and bones of revered elders were kept in sacred places, consulted, spoken to, sometimes even washed and perfumed, not out of morbidity but out of respect. These remains were not relics but companions. They reminded the people that lineage was not broken by death and that wisdom, once earned, never truly disappeared. Natural places held particular spiritual weight. Caves were portals to the underworld and the womb of origin. According to one widespread myth, the first Tuna people emerged from caves in the earth, climbing out into the light to begin the human journey. Rivers were sacred not only for their water, but because they were veins of the land, and mountains were revered as the thrones of the most powerful zemis, their peaks often veiled in mist, untouchable and awe-inspiring. Ritual offerings were simple but meaningful: fruits, tobacco, fish, feathers, words. These gifts were not bribes, but acknowledgments. To give was to remember one's place in the order of things, not above nature, not outside the spirit world, but within it, dependent on its balance, subject to its laws. This humility, so deeply woven into their cosmology, was not weakness. It was clarity, and it made them powerful in a way their conquerors would never understand. Children were raised within this worldview from birth. Naming ceremonies invoked the protection of specific spirits. Coming-of-age rituals included fasts, tasks, and teachings from elders and bohíques, not to mold them into obedient citizens, but to initiate them into a cosmic story where their life would have meaning far beyond themselves. Morality was not imposed through punishment or commandment. It was modeled through example and memory. To live well was to live in right relation, with others, with nature, and with the invisible forces that whispered just beneath the surface of things. Even death was not an end, but a crossing. The dead passed into the care of the ancestors, joining the ranks of the remembered, influencing the lives of the living through signs and silence. Funerary rites were not acts of closure, but of continuation. To bury someone was to entrust them to the same forces that had once brought rain to the fields or healed a wound with the leaf of a tree. In this world, there was no separation between science and spirit, between body and soul, between earth and sky. The Tuna had woven all these elements together into a coherent living system, a cosmology that gave meaning to suffering, direction to joy, and shape to the unseen. They did not ask for conquest. They did not need salvation. They had gods of their own. and they listened to them. There are moments in history when everything seems unchanged, when the days unfold with their usual light, when the winds blow familiar patterns across the sea, and the animals, the forests, the people all follow the same unbroken rhythm they have known for generations. And yet, in that illusion of continuity, something waits, unseen, unsensed, already moving toward the world that has no name for it. For the Tuna, the final days before the arrival of the Europeans were just like any other. The sun rose gently over the sea. The cassava was harvested in quiet ceremony. The children laughed beneath the trees, and the elders told the same stories they had always told, with no reason to believe they were about to become the last keepers of a complete way of life. There was no prophecy that warned them, no omen they could decipher. The spirits had not fallen silent, and the mountains had not trembled. If anything, the world felt calm, perhaps too calm. The hurricanes had not come that year. The rains had been generous, the fish plentiful. Some villages held dances of gratitude. Others celebrated new births. There was no fear in the land, only the kind of peace that comes when people know their place in the cycle of things and feel no reason to question it. Yet somewhere beyond their horizon, invisible to even the most watchful bohíques, a force unlike anything they had ever imagined was already crossing the sea. Not a storm, not a famine, not a war from another island, but something deeper, more disorienting. The beginning of another world pressing into theirs, slow and certain, like a shadow stretching just beyond the corner of the eye. They had never seen a map, and yet their territory was about to be redrawn. They had never known slavery, and yet their freedom was about to be redefined. They had never conceived of extinction, and yet their language, their songs, their gods, their very names stood at the edge of being forgotten. In those final days, no voice shouted a warning. No great migration stirred the land. Instead, life continued as it had for centuries. The villages traded their goods across the sea. Fishermen moved between islands, bringing salt, cotton, food, and stories. The butyas echoed with the sounds of ritual games and communal songs. Lovers carved initials into tree bark. Grandmothers wove new hammocks for unborn children. It was a world still expanding in memory, not yet shrinking under the weight of invasion. And then, on an ordinary morning, beneath an ordinary sky, everything began to shift. Far to the east, barely a sliver on the water, something appeared that had no shape in their memory. Not a canoe, not a cloud. Something taller than the tallest tree, white like bird wings but unmoving, unnatural. The first ones to see it thought it a mirage, a spirit form, perhaps a zemi wandering across the ocean, carrying messages to another island. The elders narrowed their eyes but said nothing. Some bohíques watched the waves in silence. The children laughed and pointed. The shape grew larger each day. More followed it. 3 at first. Then more. The sea no longer belonged only to them. Still, there was no panic. No alarm sounded. The Tuna were not a people shaped by suspicion. They had encountered strangers before, from other islands, other tongues. And they had always extended their welcome, their food, their rest, and when needed, their protection. They had no way of knowing that this time would be different. That the men on those ships did not come seeking kinship, but dominion. These final days before contact were marked not by fear, but by faith. Faith in the cycles that had always sustained them. Faith in the land that had never betrayed them. Faith in the spirits that watched from above and below, and faith in their own hospitality as a shield against harm. There was no reason to prepare for war. There was no word for invasion. There was only the horizon, and the certainty that whatever came from it would be met not with violence, but with openness. And so, as the ships approached, The Tana sharpened no blades. They dug no trenches. They did not hide their women or their children. Instead, they stood at the water's edge, waiting. The wind carried the scent of wood smoke and salt. The waves curled gently over the sand. The birds flew in their usual patterns. And the horizon, once silent, once still, began to speak. They came closer each day, no longer silhouettes on the horizon, but towering structures of timber and sail, moving with a confidence that needed no invitation. Their presence was no longer a question whispered among fishermen or a riddle debated by elders. It was a fact, undeniable and approaching, carried by the wind itself. The ships, unlike anything the Tana had ever seen, creaked and groaned like living beasts, with sails that flapped like wings and wooden mouths that opened to release pale men who shouted in harsh, cutting voices. What once had the aura of myth or vision had become a tangible presence, undeniable and heavy. The strangers had arrived. The Tana did not meet them with weapons drawn. That was not their way. Instead, the caciques gathered with the bohíques and elders and made offerings of fruit, woven goods, and smoked fish. They sent canoes out to the ships, not to defend their land, but to extend peace across the water. The strangers, wrapped in metal and cloth, with skin pale like moonstone and beards like tangled vines, looked down upon them with guarded curiosity, not knowing that they were being greeted with sacred intention, not mere formality. There was no shared language, and yet gestures were made. Hands open, food passed, smiles attempted. The Taíno spoke with calm voices, trusting the universality of kindness. They did not know that these visitors carried other intentions beneath their expressions, dreams not of alliance, but of ownership. They did not know that these ships carried not only men, but maps already drawn, laws already written, and a hunger that would not be fed with cassava and sweet potato. The Taíno watched them with wonder. Their ships were taller than trees, their animals unlike anything known, great beasts with hooves and eyes of fire. Some men rode them as if they were part of their own bodies, leading the Taíno to wonder whether they were truly human or some new breed of zemi made flesh. The sound of their language struck the ear like metal against stone. Their movements were abrupt, their rituals alien. They knelt before objects made of gold, not earth. They wore symbols the Taíno did not recognize. And yet none of this was cause for fear, only curiosity. The cacique Guacanagari, one of the first to meet the man known as Cristobal Colon, welcomed him with generosity. He offered not only food and water but assistance when one of the foreign ships, the Santa Maria, wrecked upon the reef. Colon responded by building a small outpost, La Novedad, using the remains of the ship, and leaving behind several men who promised to live in peace with the local villagers. The Taíno, unaware of European hierarchy, imagined this as a kind of friendship, a mutual recognition. They had no reason to expect betrayal. And in truth, at first, there were no open hostilities. The Taíno and the Europeans exchanged gifts. The foreigners marveled at the beauty of the land and the gentleness of the people. They spoke of paradise in their letters, of innocence and abundance, of a people who gave everything for nothing and who lacked all malice. But they also spoke of gold. Always the gold. The glint of it in the rivers, the shimmer of it in the jewelry worn by the caciques, the casual way the Taíno spoke of its presence in the mountains. To the Europeans, gold was not beauty, it was empire. It was promise. It was justification. The Taíno, in their generosity, revealed the rivers where the golden sand collected. They spoke of sacred hills where the yellow stone could be found. To them it was decoration, a gift of the land. But to the men in armor, it was currency, conquest, and power. The Tana had no way of knowing that by sharing this knowledge, they were sealing their own fate. As more ships arrived, Carrying more men, more animals, and more weapons, the balance shifted. The Europeans began demanding rather than asking, commanding rather than offering. They interpreted Taíno courtesy as submission, their silence as consent, their patience as inferiority. They erected crosses in the soil without permission, claimed rivers in the name of kings the Taíno had never heard of, and spoke of laws that no one had agreed to. And yet many of the Taíno continued to welcome them, trusting that these changes were temporary, that these strangers would leave or adapt, or eventually come to understand. There was no precedent in their world for what was unfolding. The idea that someone could arrive from across the sea and declare ownership of land they had never walked, of forests they had not planted, of people they had just met, that idea did not exist. It was beyond imagination. But imagination was no longer enough. The ships had arrived. The guests were no longer guests. And the world was already beginning to change, quietly, gradually, but irreversibly. What began as curiosity became confusion, and what followed confusion soon turned to sorrow. The Europeans did not understand the Taíno, but worse still, they believed there was nothing to understand. Where the Taíno saw relationship, the Europeans saw hierarchy. Where the Taíno offered generosity, the Europeans perceived opportunity. And where the Tuna lived by balance, the newcomers imposed extraction. The most tragic misunderstandings are not those born from silence, but from assumptions, when one side refuses to learn and instead assumes superiority. The Europeans wrote in their diaries that the Tuna had no religion because they did not worship in temples of stone. They wrote that they had no laws because they had no prisons or written codes. They wrote that they had no culture because their stories were sung and not inked on scrolls. These were not observations, they were dismissals. Through them, the colonizers constructed a justification that the Taíno were simple and therefore needed guidance, that they were childlike and therefore needed control, that they were abundant in land and gold and therefore destined to be used. From these beliefs came systems, not just attitudes but policies. The Requerimiento, a document read aloud in Spanish to people who did not understand the language, declared that the Taíno must submit to the authority of the Spanish crown and the church. If they refused, or more often, if they simply did not respond, they were considered rebels and enemies. And so, with words they could not comprehend, entire communities were condemned. The first abuses were not yet systematic, but they were immediate. Settlers began demanding labor from villages near the forts. They took food without compensation, commandeered homes, and forced the Tuna to carry heavy loads over long distances. The outpost of La Navidad, left by Columbus after his first voyage, became infamous not for peace, but for violence. The Europeans left behind their killed, raped, and plundered so relentlessly that, upon Columbus's return, the settlement had been destroyed, its men slain, not by enemies from another empire, but by the very people they had claimed to civilize. But instead of prompting reflection, this failure only hardened the colonial resolve. Columbus returned not with apologies, but with reinforcements. More horses, more weapons, and this time with explicit royal permission to extract wealth, secure land, and establish dominance. The Taíno were no longer partners or curiosities, they were resources. The Spanish crown, eager to fund its ambitions in Europe, expected dividends. And those dividends would be paid in blood, sweat, and gold. To extract that gold, they needed labor. And so began the encomienda system, justified as protection and instruction, but in truth, a mechanism of forced servitude. Each settler was granted the right to the labor of a number of Taíno in exchange for teaching them Christianity and offering them security. But in practice, this meant long days under the sun, working in mines and fields, carrying loads, enduring beatings, and watching their way of life disappear, not gradually, but rapidly and without mercy. The Tana, whose communities had been built on mutual aid, had no cultural frame for this kind of slavery. They had practiced forms of temporary servitude in the past. Captives of war might be incorporated into villages, but never as permanent degradation, never as generational chains, and never under the lash of foreigners who claimed both divine right and royal authority. At first, many complied, believing perhaps that this arrangement was temporary, or that submission might protect their families. But as months passed and the demands grew, they began to see that the goal was not coexistence, but domination. Those who resisted were met with swift punishment. Entire villages burned, leaders captured or killed, women taken as concubines, children orphaned. Hunger spread. Crops were abandoned as communities fractured. The men were taken into the mines. The women left to tend to everything else, including wounds that could not be seen. Diseases arrived: smallpox, measles, influenza, sicknesses the Taíno had never known and for which they had no resistance. Bodies fell not only from beatings and labor, but from invisible enemies that traveled in breath and blood. The land, once abundant, now grew silent. The forests no longer echoed with song. The bohíques were empty. The zemis hidden, broken, or discarded, not because the spirits had failed, but because the people no longer had the strength to speak with them. And still in Spanish records, the Taíno were described as idle, as unwilling, as ungrateful. Their suffering was rebranded as stubbornness. Their collapse was framed as the inevitable result of contact between civilization and savagery. But there was no savagery in the Taíno response, only confusion, sorrow, and the slow realization that the guests they had welcomed were not guests at all, but executioners wearing the garments of kings and the symbols of God. The misery deepened, not because the Taíno lacked strength, but because everything they had ever known had been built on the belief that harmony was possible. And now, that belief was being tested in a way no spirit had ever prepared them for. What they had offered in peace was now used against them. What they had shared in trust was now weaponized. And what they had built over centuries was being torn apart, day by day, name by name, until soon, even their memory would be called into question. It is easy to mistake gentleness for weakness. That mistake was made repeatedly by those who came with banners and swords, who believed that a people who welcomed strangers with open arms would submit just as easily when those strangers turned violent. But the Tana were not a people without spirit. Their strength did not lie in fortresses or warships, but in memory, in kinship, and in their capacity to endure without forgetting who they were. And when that identity came under attack, not once, not in isolation, but systemically, brutally, and unrelentingly, it did not vanish. It resisted. The enslavement of the Taíno was not an accident of history. It was engineered. It was built into the economic machinery of colonization from the very beginning. The encomienda system, presented as a civilizing mission, became a tool of mass subjugation. Entire communities were assigned like livestock to European settlers, and with them, every hour of their lives. Men were forced into the gold mines, digging endlessly under the tropical heat, far from their homes, unable to see their children grow. Women were made to serve in kitchens and fields, their labor taken and their bodies often violated. The young were made messengers, servants, slaves in all but name. And still, through that fog of humiliation, sparks of resistance began to glow. The first uprisings were quiet, seeds of rebellion carried in songs and whispers. Messages were passed between villages through oral networks too fast for the colonizers to decipher. Caciques who once coordinated trade began to coordinate escape. Some burned their crops rather than let them be taken. Others fled to the mountains, forming independent communities hidden deep in forests that no European had yet dared to enter. These early resistors, known later as Summerons, refused to live under the boot of empire. They chose exile over chains, and in doing so, they began to reshape the terms of survival. One name rises from this moment like a drumbeat that still echoes centuries later: Agüeybaná and Hatuey, also called Agüeybaná el Bravo. He was not the first to resist, nor the last, but he stands as a symbol of the moment when resistance ceased to be reaction and became declaration. A respected cacique of Bohíques, now known as Puerto Rico, Agüeybaná saw with clarity that negotiation would no longer protect his people. He understood that submission only sharpened the blade, and so, with the strength of the old stories and the fire of the mountains behind him, he chose war. The rebellion he led was not a campaign of hatred, but a desperate defense of life, culture, and dignity. Alongside other Taínos, he orchestrated coordinated attacks on Spanish settlements, driving back soldiers and burning outposts. For a time, the mountains echoed with the sounds of Taíno victory, brief, fragile, but real. They had struck fear into the hearts of those who had claimed to be invincible. They had shown the world that even a people nearly broken could rise and strike with purpose. The Spanish responded with overwhelming force. Reinforcements were sent. Punishments grew more severe. Reprisals were merciless. Those suspected of aiding the rebellion were executed without trial. Villages suspected of sheltering fighters were burned. Captives were mutilated, displayed, and used as warnings. It was not war in the sense of armies clashing. It was extermination masquerading as order. Agüeybaná himself is said to have died in battle, though no one knows for certain where his body lies. What remains is his name, preserved not by his enemies, but by his descendants and by the land itself. His memory became a symbol, not only of what was lost, but of what refused to die. And he was not alone. Across the Caribbean, similar figures rose. Hatuey, who fled from Hispaniola to Cuba and led a resistance that became legend. Enriquillo, who would lead a long and bitter rebellion years later in the mountains of Bahoruco, and countless others whose names are not recorded in Spanish letters, but whispered in the oral memory of survivors. These were not isolated men. They were leaders of communities who chose to resist not out of hatred, but out of love. Love for their families, their ancestors, their gods, and their way of life. Resistance also took quieter forms. Some Taíno disguised their rituals behind Christian prayers, preserving their beliefs in secret. Others used the colonizers' own language to negotiate delays, misdirect soldiers, or sabotage operations from within. Some married into African communities of escaped slaves, merging cultures in the highlands, and giving birth to new forms of identity that would carry the Taíno spirit forward, even after the census no longer counted their names. And so, while the empire claimed victory on paper, while reports spoke of pacification, while church bells rang in Europe for missions accomplished, the reality was something far more complex. The Taíno were not erased. They were fractured. They were hunted. But in every corner of the Caribbean, in the soil, in the bloodlines, in the cadence of certain words, and in the shape of quiet defiance, they remained. Enslavement brought misery. Resistance brought hope. And in that tension, between what was taken and what was defended, the soul of a people refused to disappear. To read the letters of the colonizers, the decrees of crowns and councils, the records kept by clerics and chroniclers, is to encounter a strange and chilling certainty that the Taíno had vanished. They write of a people extinguished, a race dissolved by war, disease, and assimilation. They speak of extinction not as tragedy, but as outcome, as if the tuna had melted into the soil, as if they had never truly existed beyond the moment of first contact. But history, as it is written by victors, often confuses absence with silence, and silence with death. What the records erase, the land remembers. And what the land remembers, the people carry still. Yes, the devastation was vast. Entire villages vanished in the span of a single generation. Languages faded as mothers taught their children to survive, not to speak. Rituals that had once been performed under the open sky were pushed into caves, into memories, into metaphors buried beneath Christian names and European customs. The zemis were hidden or destroyed. The bohíques were hunted, converted, or killed. Entire lines of wisdom snapped like threads pulled too tight. What had once been a world in motion was shattered into fragments, some lost, some buried, some merely waiting. And yet, in the most unexpected places, the Taíno spirit lingered. It lingered in the gardens of old women who still planted cassava in spiral patterns, not because anyone had told them to, but because their mothers had, and theirs before them. It lingered in lullabies whose words no longer made sense in Spanish, but which still soothed bobbies into sleep. It lingered in the stories told at dusk about mountains that breathed, rivers that listened, and caves that led to other worlds. It lingered in gestures, in rhythms, in recipes, in beliefs that did not match the catechism but which no priest could fully erase. And it lingered in blood. For centuries, Caribbean identity was forced into binaries, Spaniard or slave, European or African, colonizer or colonized. The tuna, by contrast, were labeled extinct, a people without descendants, a vanished culture. But genetics would later tell another story. In the early 21st century, DNA studies conducted across the Caribbean revealed something the people themselves already knew in their bones. That Taíno ancestry lived on, not in ruins or relics, but in the bodies of millions. Their bloodlines had not disappeared. They had interwoven, adapted, endured. But even before the science confirmed it, the truth had been alive in oral history. In Puerto Rico, in Cuba, in the Dominican Republic and Haiti, in Jamaica and beyond, families had kept quiet traditions, ways of preparing food, ways of burying the dead, ways of reading the stars. In remote regions, descendants of the Cimarrones still honored both African ancestors and Taíno spirits. There were places where no school taught the old names, but the children still heard them from the mouths of grandmothers who carried those names like seeds in their voices. The culture had not vanished. It had gone underground. And today, slowly, painfully, it rises again. Across the Caribbean and among diasporas abroad, a new generation has begun the work of remembrance. Artists carve new zemis. Historians retranslate the old documents. Linguists try to reconstruct the Arawakan tongue. Communities hold ceremonies in sacred sites once thought abandoned. They do not claim to return to the past unchanged, but to carry its essence forward, with humility, with grief, and with pride. To say the Taíno are gone is to misunderstand what survival looks like after apocalypse. It does not always come with fanfare or flags. It comes quietly, through persistence, through the refusal to forget, through the courage to speak a forbidden name out loud, again and again, until it begins to live once more. They were never extinct. They were interrupted. And now they are being remembered, not as a vanished people frozen in the tragedy of conquest, but as ancestors who continue to speak, if only we are willing to listen. History, when told only by the powerful, becomes an echo chamber of conquest, a catalog of victories and losses measured by empires, dates, and maps. But beneath that noise, there are other names, names that do not appear in the treaties, that are not carved into stone, but that once carried entire worlds in the breath of their syllables. Names whispered by rivers, sung by the wind, buried in silence and waiting to rise again. Names like Agüeybaná and Hatuey, Gurakaya. Names that stood before the cross and the crown, not in ignorance, but in defiance. Names that were not erased, but stolen. And now we say them aloud. To remember the Tana is not an act of nostalgia. It is an act of justice. It is to declare that a people's worth is not defined by whether their cities reached the sky, or whether their languages were written in stone. It is to affirm that peace is not weakness, that hospitality is not submission, and that cultural memory can survive even the most brutal silences. The Tana were not a footnote. They were a chapter, a civilization, a cosmos unto itself. And though much was taken, land, language, life, what endures is the undeniable truth that the Tana spirit was never fully extinguished. It endured in gardens and names, in lullabies and blood, in quiet acts of remembrance passed from mother to child, from elder to sky, from the bones of mountains to the eyes of those who still carry that inheritance today. So when you walk along Caribbean shores and feel the rhythm of waves, when you hear names that sound older than the maps that contain them, when you see a child dance without fear under the open sky, know that you are not watching the aftermath of extinction. You are witnessing survival. You are hearing a voice that was never truly silent, only waiting for the world to listen again. And if that voice has reached you, if this story has moved you, taught you, or awakened something long buried, then let it echo farther. Let it rise again, not as history but as legacy. Because stories like this one deserve to live. And if you wish to walk deeper into the forgotten, the sacred, the silenced, then subscribe. Help us carry the names that the world tried to forget. Not just for them, but for all of us who still believe that the past has something urgent to teach the living.